No one ever really prepares you for the moment when your whole life collapses in the span of a single afternoon. For Mesa, it happened when she was just 19. The sun above the desert was merciless that day, as if nature itself had conspired with her fate. She was on her knees, the coarse sand biting into her skin through the thin fabric of her black burqa. Her hands trembled, not from fear anymore, but from the shock of humiliation. Her father's eyes, cold and unflinching, pierced her from across the courtyard in front of the mosque. He didn't cry, didn't shout. He just stood there, arms crossed, jaw clenched, the picture of honor above love, of tradition above mercy. Mesa wasn't even supposed to be out there, exposed like that. But in her small village, when a daughter defied her father and rejected a marriage to a man 40 years her senior, punishment was public, symbolic, and severe. She had fled the night before with little more than some cash and a few clothes, thinking she could disappear beyond the dunes. But you can't outrun family. Not there. They found her before dawn, dragged her back, and now here she was, punished not just for escaping, but for daring to dream of a different life. Around her, people whispered, some with judgment, others with pity, but no one helped. No one dared. Then something unexpected happened. A black Toyota Prado pulled up near the edge of the gathering, the engine cutting into the heavy silence. The crowd turned, curious. A man stepped out, tall, composed, wrapped in pristine white robes that caught the wind like wings. His presence shifted the air. Even the villagers recognized him. Farouk al-Rasir, a wealthy sheikh from the Emirates, known for funding schools and clinics in remote regions. He wasn't from there. He had no stake in the village's rules, no reason to get involved. Yet, as his eyes locked onto Mesa's, just for a second, something cracked in the atmosphere. She had lifted her head, not to plead, but simply to look. A look that didn't ask for saving, but dared to be seen. And something in her expression stopped him cold. Her father approached him, stiff with nerves and pride, and offered a formal greeting, trying to turn the moment into business as usual. But Farouk didn't reply. He just stared at the girl in the sand. Then, with a movement that stunned everyone, he walked away, not toward the mosque, not back to his car, but directly to her. The silence was suffocating, and then he said just 2 words, "Stand up." No one knew what would happen next, not even Mesa. Mesa didn't move at first. Her knees were raw, her body weak from the hours she'd spent under the brutal sun. But it wasn't just physical pain holding her back. It was fear. Fear of what would happen if she obeyed, and fear of what would happen if she didn't. Her eyes flicked to her father, then to the murmuring crowd. But Farouk's voice came again, firmer this time. "Stand up." And something in the way he said it, not as a command, but as if he were pulling her out of a place too dark to escape alone, made her legs find the strength. Slowly, shakily, she rose to her feet. Her heart thundered in her chest, not because she knew what was happening, but because she didn't. She waited for Farouk to speak again, to explain himself, but instead he turned to her father and said something no one could have imagined. "I want to marry your daughter." The silence that followed was deafening. Ahmed's face went pale. The villagers gasped and whispered. This was not how things were done. She was disgraced, broken, shamed in front of everyone. No man of Farouk's standing would ever want her. And yet, he had said it, calmly, with conviction. Her father, caught between confusion and hope, stammered out, "It would be an immeasurable honor, Sheikh Farouk." Just like that, everything changed. 1 hour later, Mesa was in the back seat of the black car, flanked by 2 silent assistants in immaculate robes. She didn't speak. She didn't even know if she could. Her mind couldn't catch up with her reality. They had left the village behind in a cloud of dust, the road stretching out endlessly ahead. No one explained anything. No one asked her what she wanted. The car rolled through the desert for hours until the landscape changed. Dunes gave way to glass towers and paved streets. Abu Dhabi. Eventually, they stopped in front of a stark Islamic courthouse. Mesa was guided inside without a word. The room was simple, quiet, but everything about it felt heavy. An elderly judge sat behind a wooden desk, flanked by 2 witnesses. Farouk appeared beside her, still silent, still unreadable. The ceremony was short, formal. Contracts were read, responsibilities listed. Then the question came, "Do you accept this marriage?" Mesa looked around, lost. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know who he really was, but he had stopped the punishment. He had saved her. And maybe, just maybe, that meant something. Her voice barely above a whisper, she answered, "I do." There were no flowers, no music, no celebration. No one smiled, not even her. When the papers were signed, the judge offered a quiet Mabruk, but even that felt hollow. Farouk led her outside without touching her, speaking only once they were back in the car. "You are legally my wife now," he said, eyes fixed on the horizon, voice steady but distant. Mesa didn't know how to respond. Her thoughts spiraled. Was she rescued or trapped? She looked at him, trying to read his expression, but it was unreadable. "But I don't want your body," he continued without turning toward her. "Only your freedom." That made her pause. It didn't make sense. He added, "I'm promised to someone else, a distant cousin. She understands." The words hit like a sudden chill. If he already had someone, why marry her? The answer didn't come, just silence. A complicated, heavy silence that filled every inch of the car. Gratitude twisted with confusion inside her chest. She had been spared from a forced marriage, yet now belonged to a stranger who claimed to want nothing from her. It didn't feel like freedom, not yet. When they arrived at what could only be described as a palace, Mesa could hardly breathe. The sheer size of it overwhelmed her. Marble floors that reflected the ceiling lights like still water, columns that stretched toward the sky, and a quiet so pristine it made her feel like a shadow in someone else's life. Farouk led her through hallways that smelled faintly of jasmine and something colder, maybe solitude. They stopped at a large wooden door. "This will be your room," he said, opening it. Inside was a spacious suite with high ceilings, a massive bed, a writing desk, and shelves lined with books. "From now on, no one will force you to do anything. This key is yours." He placed a golden key into her hand without looking her in the eye. "Tomorrow, you'll have clothes, books. You can choose what to study. You're free." And then, just like that, he turned and left. She stood there, alone in the center of a room that could have been beautiful if it hadn't felt so hollow. She sank onto the edge of the bed, her body finally registering the exhaustion she had pushed away for days. Her new reality hadn't sunk in yet. Married, transported across the country, given a room in a mansion by a man who didn't want her. Mesa didn't feel free. She felt like a question that no one had answered. That night, Mesa didn't sleep. The sheets were soft, the room dimly lit by a small golden lamp, but nothing felt comforting. She lay on top of the blankets, fully clothed, staring at the ornate ceiling, heart racing with thoughts she couldn't organize. She was married, but to a man who hadn't even looked her in the eyes during the ceremony. A man who had walked into her punishment, interrupted it with a few decisive words, and now claimed to want nothing from her. But wasn't that still ownership, in some form? He said she was free. But what kind of freedom comes without choice? Slowly, she rose and stepped in front of the mirror. For the first time in days, she saw herself not through the eyes of her father or the villagers, but her own. Her skin was pale, marked by the desert sun, but her eyes were sharp. Her reflection stared back at her with something fierce. She removed the black burqa and let it fall to the floor. The fabric whispered against the marble as it pooled at her feet. She took a deep breath, unclothed and unsure, but no longer invisible. Just then, she heard footsteps in the corridor. Her heart stopped. The door creaked open. Farouk stood there. Neither of them spoke. His eyes scanned the room, then found her. Exposed, vulnerable, yet standing. His jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't move forward. She lowered her gaze, expecting him to come closer, but he didn't. He stood there unmoving, wrestling with something invisible. Then, wordlessly, he turned and closed the door behind him. It was that moment that broke something open inside her. Not the silence, not the loneliness, but the restraint in his eyes, the way he had looked at her and chosen not to move. It was confusing, unsettling, but also oddly respectful. The days that followed unfolded in quiet monotony. Meals were left outside her door, 3 times a day, always warm, always untouched by human interaction. No one spoke to her, no one visited. The palace was grand, but lifeless, like a museum preserved for someone else's legacy. Mesa wandered the halls carefully at first, feeling like an intruder in a world where everything was precise and cold. Sometimes she'd pause at a window and watch the city below, so modern, so full of motion, and wonder how she had ended up there. Each step she took down those corridors felt like claiming something, even if she didn't know what yet. One morning she dared to walk farther and turned a corner into a sunlit courtyard. There he was, Farouk, speaking on the phone, gesturing with slow precision. She froze. He hadn't seen her, so she watched. There was something captivating in how he moved, how his presence filled the space without force. She didn't understand why, but she couldn't look away. Then, as if sensing her, he turned. Their eyes met. He gave a brief, polite nod, not as a husband, not even as someone familiar. It was the nod of a stranger acknowledging another's existence. Mesa returned the gesture, then walked away quickly, her chest tight with questions she didn't dare ask. From that day on, Mesa began to explore more freely. The palace, once a cold maze, slowly became a map of secrets she wanted to uncover. She found a massive library with shelves stretching to the ceiling, filled with books in Arabic, French, and English, titles about history, science, literature, and most notably, stories about women who had defied the worlds around them. She spent hours there, sometimes losing track of time entirely, sitting on the floor with piles of books around her like a fortress. In one corner, she discovered a dusty notebook and began scribbling thoughts, half-formed questions, and bits of poetry in her broken French. It became her lifeline, not to the world outside, but to herself. Farouk remained a ghost, present only in the faint sound of footsteps in distant halls or in the quiet clinking of glasses during late-night meetings she never witnessed. And yet, his absence was strangely louder than any presence she had ever known. He wasn't avoiding her out of cruelty. She didn't believe that anymore. But out of something else. Distance, caution, maybe even guilt. Or maybe, like her, he didn't know how to be around someone who reminded him of decisions that didn't follow logic. Then, one afternoon, something shifted. Alongside her usual lunch tray, a maid she had never seen before left a stack of books tied with a ribbon. They were newer, more specific. Literature, philosophy, even sociology, all in French and Arabic. Mesa raised an eyebrow. She hadn't asked for them. Tucked between the books was an envelope. Inside, an acceptance letter from the Sorbonne in Paris, for a program in literature and philosophy. Mesa stared at it for a long time, unsure if it was real. Her name was there, her photo, the emblem of the university. How? She had never applied. Her hands trembled as she reached for the bottom of the stack, where she found something even more jarring. A passport, newly issued, and a plane ticket. Abu Dhabi to Paris. Departure in 1 week. Along with it, a note from a real estate agency with the address of an apartment already leased in her name, fully paid for 1 year. It was too much, too sudden, too exact. She sat down on the edge of her bed, the pages scattered across her lap, and felt the room shrink around her. Was this a gift, or was it a dismissal? A liberation or an escape route he was offering for both of them? Her fingers brushed the golden key on her nightstand, the symbol of freedom he once promised. But what if it was never freedom at all, just a softer kind of exile? That night, Mesa couldn't sleep. She lay awake with the envelope still in her hands, reading the words over and over until they blurred into each other. For most of her life, Paris had been a fantasy, the kind of dream that felt too distant to ever chase. And now it was one plane ride away. A door had opened, wide and shining, and all she had to do was walk through it. But why now? Why just when she had started to feel the stirrings of something more? Not just inside the palace, but inside herself. For days she had woken up feeling different. Not quite content, but not broken either. She found herself watching for the sound of Farouk's footsteps, hoping for a glance, a word, anything to break the silence between them. And now, when the silence had become almost familiar, he was sending her away. Her fingers hovered over the plane ticket, then reached for the notebook she'd been writing in. She opened it to a fresh page, and without thinking too hard, scribbled one sentence. Does freedom always cost loneliness? She stared at the words, knowing they didn't hold the full weight of what she was feeling. But they were close. Outside, the desert wind howled faintly against the windows, and for the first time in a long time, she let herself cry. Not because she was afraid of leaving, but because she didn't know why it hurt so much that he wanted her to go. The morning of her departure came like a whisper, without fanfare or farewells. The bags were packed, the car was ready. The golden key sat alone on the nightstand. left behind like a symbol of a chapter she wasn't sure she ever understood. Mesa stood in the center of the room, holding her passport, her ticket, the letter from Sorbonne. Her life had been rewritten in a matter of months. From a village girl sentenced to public shame to a scholarship student bound for one of the most prestigious universities in Europe. And yet, none of it felt victorious. It felt like a life someone else had scripted for her, like a play she'd stepped into too late to change the ending. There was one thing she couldn't leave without: answers. So instead of heading straight for the car, she walked, for the first time, to Farouk's office. She didn't knock. The door was slightly ajar, and he was standing by the window, as if expecting her. "The car will be here in an hour," he said without turning. His voice was calm, composed, distant. Mesa stepped inside and closed the door. Her heart beat like a drum inside her chest. "Why are you sending me away?" she asked, her voice low but steady. He didn't answer at first. "Is this your way of rejecting me?" she continued. Slowly, Farouk turned, and in his eyes she saw something she hadn't seen before. Not coldness, not distance, but struggle. The kind that came from feeling too much, not too little. Farouk didn't answer right away. He stood there, his hands clenched at his sides, breathing as if every word he might say required effort. "I don't reject you," he said finally, quietly. But the words didn't soothe her. They only confused her more. "Then why?" she asked, stepping closer. "We're married, Farouk. But you've never touched me, never even looked at me like I mattered. So what am I to you? A responsibility? A debt?" The questions came out sharper than she intended, laced with the pain she had bottled for weeks. For a moment she thought he would dismiss her again, but instead, he closed his eyes as if her words physically struck him. "You're not a debt," he said, barely above a whisper. "You're everything I've tried not to feel." Mesa stared at him. His walls, so carefully built, were beginning to crack. "You think I don't see how you watch me when you think I'm not looking? You think I don't know what it means when someone keeps their distance to protect themselves, not the other person?" She stepped closer again, until she was only a breath away. "So tell me the truth. Why marry me if you didn't want me?" His voice trembled, not from fear, but from holding back. "Because you deserved better than what your life was becoming. I thought if I gave you freedom, you'd find yourself, become someone stronger than what your world allowed you to be." His eyes finally met hers. "I never expected to fall in love with you along the way." The silence that followed was heavy and sacred. Mesa didn't move, didn't speak. It was as if the air had thickened between them, making it hard to breathe. She wasn't sure what hurt more, the confession or the delay in hearing it. "You fell in love," she echoed, her voice soft. "And that's why you sent me away?" Farouk nodded. "Because I didn't want to hold you back. Because I didn't think I deserved the right to love you. Not with your whole life ahead of you. Not when I thought I was just a man who saved you. Not someone worthy of staying by your side." She took another step forward and placed her hand on his chest, not to push him away, but to feel the truth of his heartbeat. "You say I needed to find myself. Well, I did. And now I know that I don't want to live in a world where I'm free but empty." Her hand trembled, but her eyes didn't. "I wanted to be seen, and you saw me. You always did. You just never let yourself believe it meant something." Farouk looked at her like a man drowning in everything he never dared admit. But even now, even with her so close, he whispered, "I can't ask you to stay. I've already taken too much." Mesa let her hand drop slowly. "You're not asking," she said. "You're running." And then, with the quiet dignity of a woman no longer begging to be chosen, she turned and walked toward the door. Farouk didn't call after her. He didn't beg. He didn't move. And that, more than anything, was what broke Mesa on the inside. She had offered him something no one ever had. Not obedience, not gratitude, but choice. And he had stood frozen. As she stepped into the corridor, her heartbeat echoed louder than her footsteps. For a moment, she thought he might still come, that the sound of his voice might stop her. But silence followed her all the way back to the room where her luggage sat, untouched. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the documents in her hands. Freedom, on paper. Opportunity, perfectly timed. But she didn't feel free. She felt discarded. It wasn't the rejection that stung. It was the cowardice. He had chosen silence over truth, comfort over confrontation, and now she had no choice but to keep going. When the car arrived, she didn't look back. As the palace gates closed behind her, it felt less like an exit and more like a burial, of hope, of what could have been, of something she hadn't even had the chance to name. In the distance, the towers of the city shimmered under the desert heat, promising a future she hadn't chosen, but would now have to claim as her own. Paris was everything and nothing like she expected. The buildings were grand, the streets alive with motion, and yet, she felt like a stranger walking through someone else's dream. The apartment was modest but comfortable, tucked in a quiet street near the university. Every morning, she woke up in silence, poured her own coffee and sat by the window watching the city breathe without her. The Sorbonne was intimidating at first, ancient halls echoing with voices that seemed to know exactly who they were. On her first day, she sat in the back of the lecture hall, clutching her notebook like a shield. The professor spoke about existentialism, about how freedom was both a gift and a curse, and Mesa felt the words press against her like a truth too sharp to ignore. Slowly, she started to speak up. Her perspective, shaped by pain, rebellion, and escape, was unlike anything her classmates had heard before. A girl named Claire, sharp and talkative, took interest in her. "You don't speak like someone who just read about oppression," she had said. "You speak like someone who survived it." Mesa had only smiled. There were things she still couldn't say. But every word she spoke in class, every argument she made, felt like reclaiming a part of herself, like gathering the pieces of someone who had been shattered and learning how to fit them together again. Not perfectly, but truthfully. Weeks passed. Mesa built a routine that was hers and hers alone. She studied during the day, worked part-time at a small bookstore in the evenings, and walked home through cobblestone streets that never seemed to sleep. She didn't talk about her past, not even to Claire, though the girl asked once or twice. "You have that kind of sadness," Claire had said one night over coffee. "The kind that doesn't scream, just sits quietly in the corner and watches." Mesa had only nodded, offering no explanation. What could she say? That she had been saved by a man who never truly claimed her? That her freedom was a gift wrapped in silence and abandonment? Instead, she poured her energy into school. She wrote essays that made her professors pause and ask questions. One of them, Professor Dubois, approached her after class and said, "You speak of liberty like someone who bled for it." Mesa had looked at him and replied simply, "I did." It wasn't a lie. It was just not the whole story. At night, when the city finally rested, she would sit by the window with her notebook and write letters she never sent. To Farouk, pages filled with everything she wished she could say. Not to reopen anything, not to beg, but to understand. Each letter ended the same. "Why did you see me? Then let me go." Then came the calls. At first, just once a month. Short, formal. "How are the studies? Do you need anything?" Always polite, always distant. She tried to match his tone, but her heart betrayed her every time. When he hung up, she'd stare at the phone, wondering if he hesitated too, if he lingered over her name the way she did over his. Eventually, she stopped hoping. When the call stopped altogether, she knew she shouldn't be surprised. He had done what he said he would, given her freedom. But she hadn't realized freedom could ache this much. The day she received her first letter of academic distinction, she held the certificate in one hand and her phone in the other, fingers hovering over his name in her contact list. She didn't call. Instead, she lit a candle on the windowsill and whispered her news to the flame. "I'm becoming who you said I could be," she said aloud, and in the silence that followed, she realized how much she missed being someone to him. Not just a duty, not just a promise kept, just someone who mattered. The line between gratitude and love had always been blurry, but what she felt now wasn't blurry at all. It was longing, pure and sharp. Spring came to Paris with a quiet gentleness. The chill in the air softened. Cherry blossoms lined the boulevards, and the city seemed to stretch awake after months of sleep. Mesa had found her rhythm by then. Classes, work, reading, writing. But something inside her remained restless. There were moments when she would catch herself staring out the window during lectures, wondering what Farouk was doing, if he ever thought of her, if he regretted letting her go. Then one Tuesday afternoon, a staff member at the university approached her with a message. "Someone is here to see you," he said. Said it was important. Mesa's heart dropped. For a moment she couldn't move. She gathered her papers with trembling hands and walked toward the main entrance of the Sorbonne, her pulse rising with every step. And then she saw him. Farouk. standing just inside the arched doorway, dressed in dark gray, as composed and dignified as ever. But there was something different, a weariness in his eyes, a tension in his posture. He looked up and their eyes met. Time collapsed between them. She stepped forward slowly, the air charged and thick between them. "You're here," she said, her voice barely audible. He gave a small nod. "I'm in Paris for a conference," he began, "but I came to see you." They sat in a cafe near the university, a quiet place with dim lighting and worn tables. For a while they spoke like strangers catching up after years apart. "How are the studies?" he asked, hands wrapped tightly around his coffee cup. "They're good," she replied. "I'm a teaching assistant now." He nodded. "I knew you would be. You've always been brilliant." His compliments felt sincere but carefully measured, as though afraid to say too much. Mesa noticed the way he avoided eye contact after every sentence, like he was afraid of what her gaze might force him to confront. She waited for him to say something more, something real, but all he offered were questions about her schedule, her apartment, her safety. Not once did he ask how she was feeling. Not once did he say he missed her. She wanted to scream, "Why are you really here?" But the words stayed locked behind her teeth. When the bill came, he placed the cash down and stood. "It was good to see you," he said, and hesitated, just for a moment, before turning to leave. She watched him walk out, the door swinging closed behind him, and felt a familiar ache bloom in her chest. He had come all this way to see her, but still didn't see her. That night, Mesa sat in her apartment, staring at the half-empty cup of tea that had long since gone cold. The city outside her window moved on, lights flickering, cars rushing by, strangers laughing on sidewalks. But inside, everything was still. She had waited months for a moment like that, had imagined a reunion where he'd say the words she'd once begged to hear. "I made a mistake. I miss you. I love you." But none of that came. Instead, he had treated her like a report to be reviewed, a project revisited, checked off, and put back on the shelf. And yet, she'd felt it, that hesitation in his voice, the way he held the cup a little too tightly, the way his gaze dropped every time she looked at him too long. There was something still there, something unfinished, but it was buried beneath layers of restraint and fear. She thought back to the girl she'd been in the desert, knees in the sand, eyes full of defiance. That girl had begged for the chance to live. But this woman, this version of herself, was no longer begging. She was choosing, and right now she chose to let him go, again. Not because she wanted to, but because he still didn't know how to stay. Days passed, then weeks. The routine resumed, but something had shifted. Mesa no longer looked at her phone hoping to see his name. She no longer waited for calls that wouldn't come, or stared at the door wondering if he'd knock again. She poured herself into her writing, essays, articles, reflections on identity, silence, and self-worth. Her professor encouraged her to present one of her papers at a student exhibition, Between Sand and Self, a personal piece about navigating cultural identity and reclaiming voice after trauma. "You have a story that people need to hear," he told her. And for the first time, Mesa agreed. The day of the presentation, she wore a navy blue dress, her hair pinned back simply, her expression calm. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She just wanted to be seen, for real this time. The auditorium filled slowly, rows of students and faculty murmuring in anticipation. She didn't expect him to come. She hadn't told him. She had sent one message days earlier, not an invitation, just information. "I'll be speaking at the university, Thursday 3 p.m. Nothing more. She told herself she didn't care if he came. She told herself she didn't need him to. But when she looked to the back of the room, just before stepping onto the stage, and saw him standing there, Farouk, silent and still, his eyes locked on her, she realized that some parts of us never stop hoping. The moment she began to speak, the auditorium disappeared. Her voice, steady and clear, filled the space not with rehearsed lines, but with lived experience. She talked about silence, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that isolates. She spoke of choices made in fear, of voices muted by duty, of how sometimes freedom feels like abandonment. And she spoke of rebuilding, not just a life, but an identity, piece by piece, in a language not your own, in a country that never asked for your presence. Every word was hers, not filtered, not edited. Her pain, her resilience, her becoming. She didn't look at Farouk once while she spoke, but she felt him there, a silent gravity in the back of the room. When the applause came, it was long and warm and real. Her classmates stood. Her professor clapped with genuine pride. But Mesa didn't smile for them. She only turned toward the back, searching, and found him still standing, not applauding, not moving, just looking at her like he'd never truly seen her before. She stepped down from the stage and walked into the crowd of congratulations, of praise and handshakes, but her eyes kept flicking toward that one place, that one man. Eventually he approached, quietly. No grand gestures, no apology rehearsed. Just a man walking toward a woman he no longer had the right to claim. They stood face to face for the first time in months, surrounded by people who didn't know what was unfolding between them. "You came," she said, not as a question, but an acknowledgement. Farouk nodded. "I had to." He looked at the panel behind her, her title, her words, the story she had poured onto the page. It was powerful. The compliment was clipped, technical, but his eyes betrayed him. They were glassy, holding back something heavier than he could articulate. "You've grown," he said. She tilted her head slightly. "Isn't that what you wanted?" That caught him. He looked down, almost ashamed, then back up at her. "Yes, but I didn't think it would hurt this much." For a moment, neither of them moved. And then, without thinking, he reached for her hand, just lightly, his fingers brushing hers like he was afraid to hold on. She didn't pull away, but she didn't grip back either. "You're not here for me," she said softly. "You're here for what I became." He started to protest, but she shook her head. "You helped me get here, Farouk. But now you have to decide if you see me as someone to be proud of, or someone to be with." Farouk didn't answer right away. He looked at her with that same intensity she remembered from the desert, from the courthouse, from the palace corridor the day she left. But this time, it was different. There was no power in his gaze, no certainty, just vulnerability, the kind that only comes when a man realizes he no longer has control over the one thing he thought he would never lose. "I don't know how to be what you deserve," he finally said, voice low. "I only know that I never stopped feeling it." Mesa's throat tightened. She could feel every pair of eyes around them vanish. The world had shrunk to the space between them, one breath wide, and 1,000 regrets deep. "Then say it," she replied, her voice steadier than she expected. "Say what you've been holding back since the day you told me to go." Farouk swallowed hard, his composure visibly unraveling. "I love you." It wasn't grand or poetic. It was broken and late and almost whispered, but it was real. "I love you," he said again, stronger this time. "And I'm sorry it took me losing you to finally admit it." She didn't speak, not yet. She just looked at him, letting the weight of those words settle like dust after a storm. Later that evening, the exhibition's small reception wound down. Guests filtered out, leaving behind half-empty glasses and scattered compliments. Mesa lingered by one of her pieces, a painting titled "Between Sand and Silence." A lone figure in the desert, standing instead of kneeling, eyes open instead of hidden. She felt him beside her before she saw him. Farouk stood silently, not touching, not speaking, just present. "You knew I'd come," he said eventually. "I hoped," she corrected. "But I didn't wait." That difference meant everything now. She had moved forward, not in spite of him, but without expecting him to catch up. "You said once that I deserved more than being someone's second choice," she continued, eyes still on the canvas, "that I needed to discover who I was on my own. You were right." He nodded slowly. "But you forgot something," she said, finally looking at him. "That love isn't a chain. It's not supposed to keep someone small. It's supposed to give them room to grow and still be wanted." Farouk's voice cracked when he spoke. "I never stopped wanting you. I just thought I'd ruin you." Mesa's reply came like breath after holding it for too long. "You never ruined me. You saved me, and then you set me free. But now the only question left is, will you walk beside me, not ahead of me?" They left the gallery together that night, not as lovers reunited, not as husband and wife, but as two people on the fragile edge of something new. Mesa didn't ask where he was staying. Farouk didn't ask what time she needed to be up in the morning. They simply walked. Through quiet Parisian streets washed in golden lamplight, past cafes closing their shutters and couples whispering beneath awnings. For the first time since their marriage, they weren't surrounded by expectations, silence, or power imbalance. Just space, just breath. At the door of her building, they stopped. "Do you want to come up?" she asked. Her voice was calm, not seductive, not pleading, just honest. Farouk looked at her for a long time, his hand gently brushing her arm, and nodded. Inside, the apartment was small, nothing like the palace she once lived in, but it was warm, lived in. A scarf on the chair, tea stains on the kitchen counter, an open book on the couch. Hers, every inch. She lit a small candle and poured them tea, an old ritual, now made new. They sat on the floor by the window, knees almost touching as the city hummed outside. "You've built a life here," he said, almost reverently. "Yes," she replied, "but I never stopped wondering what it would have been like if you had asked me to stay. I thought I was doing the right thing," he admitted, his voice almost breaking. "You were so young. I didn't want to be the man who took your choices from you." Mesa smiled, but it wasn't bitter. It was tired, wise. "But you made the choice for me anyway. Just a different one." Farouk lowered his eyes. "I regret that every day." She reached for his hand then, not because she needed comfort, but because she wanted connection. "We both did the best we could with what we knew. But now, I know what I want, and I know who I am, and I don't want a savior. I want a partner." He looked up at her, and in his eyes there was no pride, no fear, just hope, raw and real. "Then let me be that, if it's not too late." Mesa studied him, the man who once stood over her in the sand, the man who watched her leave without stopping her, the man who now asked, not assumed. She leaned forward slowly, brushing her lips to his, and the kiss was nothing like she had imagined all those lonely nights. It wasn't rushed or desperate. It was careful, sacred, like two people stepping through a door they had been afraid to open for far too long. When they pulled away, neither spoke. There was nothing left to prove, nothing to explain. Just this moment, unguarded, chosen, shared. That night was not marked by grand declarations or passionate abandon. It was slower, quieter, a meeting of two people who had shed too many versions of themselves to rush into anything. Farouk held her like something precious, not fragile, but irreplaceable. He traced the curve of her back with reverence, memorizing not just her body, but the story it carried. Mesa, in turn, didn't flinch from his touch. She welcomed it, not as a reward or closure, but as a beginning. There was no need to fill the space with words. Their bodies spoke in silences, in held breaths, in careful glances, in the way she sighed when he kissed her collarbone like a promise he never got to make. When they finally lay tangled together under the dim light filtering through the curtains, Mesa rested her head against his chest and whispered, "I'm not the girl you married." His fingers traced gentle patterns on her shoulder. "I know," he said. "That's why I came back." And that was the difference. He didn't come to rescue her this time. He came to meet her, where she stood on her own 2 feet. She closed her eyes, letting his warmth anchor her, and for the first time since the desert, since the silence, since Paris, she felt whole. The days that followed didn't promise a perfect future. They were still figuring it out, who they were apart, who they wanted to be together. But something had shifted permanently. Farouk extended his stay in Paris. He attended one of her seminars, quietly proud. She visited his hotel with a plate of homemade pastries, laughing when he tried to guess the ingredients and failed. There was an ease between them now, forged not in fantasy, but in fire and patience. He didn't rush her. She didn't demand more than he could give. They met halfway, each step chosen. One evening, as they walked by the Seine, he stopped mid-sentence and turned to her. "You know," he said, "I used to think strength was control, but now I think maybe strength is being willing to risk losing everything for the truth." Mesa squeezed his hand. "Then you're stronger than you were in the desert." He smiled, not as a prince, not as a sheikh, but as a man who finally understood that love is not ownership, that freedom is not distance, that sometimes the greatest act of love is not saving someone, but standing beside them when they've saved themselves. Months later, Mesa stood in the gallery she had built from the ground up in the heart of Lyon. The walls were lined with canvases, her canvases, each one a reflection of moments she had once been too afraid to speak of. One painting in particular always drew people in. A woman kneeling in the desert, blindfolded, surrounded by heat and silence, but with her head tilted upward, defiant. Beneath it, a small plaque read, "She didn't wait to be rescued. She became the rescue." Farouk had flown in that morning, his third visit in 6 weeks. He never tried to dominate the space. He simply showed up, present, respectful, and quietly supportive. As guests mingled and admired the art, he stood beside her, not in front, not behind. When a local reporter asked about the inspiration behind the exhibit, Mesa answered calmly, "It's about the places that try to erase you, and the people who remind you to rewrite yourself instead." Later that night, they sat on the gallery steps, the city lights flickering against the cobblestones. "You were always meant to lead," Farouk said. "I just had to learn how to follow without letting go." She looked at him, eyes soft, then leaned into his shoulder. "And I had to learn that love doesn't make you smaller, not when it's real." One crisp afternoon, almost a year after she first stepped onto French soil, Mesa received a letter. A prestigious international foundation wanted to sponsor her next exhibit, a solo show in Dubai. It was surreal. The country where she had once been punished for saying no now wanted to celebrate her for saying yes to herself. She read the letter 3 times before calling Farouk. When he answered, her voice trembled. "They want me to come back, to exhibit, in Dubai." There was a pause, then a soft, proud breath on the other end. "Then they'll finally see what I saw in you all along." The idea of returning scared her, not because of the place, but because of who she had been there. She was no longer that girl, but she wasn't running anymore either. "I want you there," she said simply, "not as a guardian, not as a shadow, but as the man who stood beside me when I became who I am." Farouk didn't say, "Of course." He didn't say yes. He said, "Always." And somehow that word, simple, whole, true, carried everything they had fought for, everything they had learned, and everything they were still building. The night of the Dubai exhibition arrived with the kind of stillness that feels like the world holding its breath. Mesa stood alone in the center of the gallery, surrounded by her story, now painted across walls thousands of miles from where it had all begun. People whispered her name. Critics took notes. Dignitaries wandered from piece to piece, trying to decipher the woman behind the brushstrokes. But none of that mattered. She wasn't there for applause. She was there to reclaim a space that once tried to break her. And then, through the crowd, she saw him. Farouk, standing by the painting that had started it all. The desert, the blindfold, the silence. His eyes weren't searching the art. They were searching for her. When he found her gaze, he didn't smile. He didn't nod. He just let the truth of everything they'd lived pulse between them. When they finally met in the center of the room, he reached for her hand, and this time, she didn't hesitate. "Are you nervous?" he asked. She shook her head. "No, not anymore." And then, in the middle of a gallery that once would have caged her, Mesa leaned in and kissed him. Not because she needed to, not because anyone expected her to, but because she wanted to. Because finally, it was her choice. They left the gallery late, walking together beneath the Dubai skyline. Bold, golden, and full of echoes from another life. But they weren't chasing ghosts anymore. They were building something new, out of what had survived. The hotel room that night wasn't opulent. It was quiet, soft, filled with laughter and tea and the low hum of music they both forgot to turn off. In the morning, Mesa woke before the sun, wrapped in Farouk's arms, his breath steady against her skin. She looked at him, really looked, and saw not the man who once saved her, but the man who had learned to love her in the only way that mattered. Freely, she whispered, "I'm finally home," and didn't need a reply. Because some truths don't need to be said out loud. They live in gestures, in years waited, in hands held when it matters most. And as the first light of dawn broke through the curtains, touching their skin like a quiet blessing, Mesa closed her eyes and felt it, that rare, unmistakable peace that only comes when you've found where you truly belong. And for the first time, she knew she had written her own ending, finally, entirely hers.